you then also get Moses seen as God. Why is this a really terrible section? This section, I think, was really poorly argued because Bart gives way too much weight to Exodus 4:16. Aaron indeed shall speak for you to the people. He shall serve as a mouth for you, and you shall serve as a God for him. Here, Moses is not said actually to be God, but he will function as God. Okay, it's an argument, right? Via analogy. Aaron will be as a mouth. It's an analogy for you. So it's serving this function. So Moses serves the function of being God to Aaron. Then he says here, why does it do too much work? Well, as I mentioned earlier, one concern I had was using one source. Some later Jews took this message a step further and claimed that Moses was in fact divine. The clearest expression of this view comes in the works of the aforementioned Philo of Alexandria. And then you basically have Bart providing quotes from Philo, a single source, I should say a single author. There are multiple documents written by Philo that he quotes from. But one reason why this is really poorly argued is that many of the passages Bart pulls from could easily be understood as what many Christians, especially in the East, recognize as theosis. That Moses became divine, he became godlike because he shared in the attributes of God. Not because Moses became Yahweh. Not in that sense. And not even in the sense that the Egyptians thought that Pharaoh was a god among men to have authority and rule over them. But rather, the sense that Moses was becoming godlike. And in that regard, we do need to rightly understand in what sense. And that's one thing Bart does talk about, these clarifications. In what sense? In what sense is it that someone is claimed to be divine? And I perceive that Bart didn't do justice to the Moses idea that Moses is divine. But also, and you might read this chapter coming away thinking, well, boy, we've got this reductionistic narrative. Now, oh man, we can explain how Jesus could become divine. Don't be scared, because for those of you who have read the New Testament, you know that the Apostle Paul and others, Peter, talk about being heirs of God, being adopted, that we would become in his likeness, that we are slowly becoming more like God. And so in that same sense, you could think of Moses and these other figures as becoming like God. Not because there's this reductionistic view that so-and-so is a god among men. So those are two different concepts. It's an important nuance that I think is missing. But let me share a couple other thoughts I had. So, number one, I already mentioned this, diminishing returns. So, diminishing returns is kind of like the bang you get for your buck decreases over time, okay? It's like a royalty check. What I mean here by this is that Bart gives too much, he kind of overplays his hand, and he's really hoping for a lot more than really he actually gets. So when you use a single source and you say some Jews thought this, again, the more you do that, it's like you're decreasing the persuasiveness to the argument you're trying to make. And that's the first thing. A single source here or there, and then making a broad claim from that single source, you're really overplaying your hand. You're giving too much weight to that small piece of evidence. So I saw that quite a bit with this chapter. Number two, too broad of scope, allowing any self-identified group to be part of the whole. I already talked about that. That's a concern of methodology here in his survey of ancient Judaism. Finally, 3, the absence of nuance on theosis or messengers as representatives. Oh, I didn't even talk about this, but I will now. So this last part, messengers as representatives. That if you had an angel and so-and-so, and then you said, oh, but the Lord said or God said. Let me give an example. When an ambassador in his professional capacity speaks to a governing authority in some other nation, the ambassador represents the person who sent them. So let's say an ambassador to the United States, they are speaking on behalf of the President of the United States. And so when the ambassador speaks, the president speaks. I'm very serious. This is the way it is in professional governing settings. When you have a committee, for example, or a meeting, the ambassador is representing the President of the United States. When the ambassador speaks, the president is speaking through the ambassador. That distinction is missing from Bart's discussion of angels. And I think that's a relevant distinction, because there are times in which one might say that the angel who speaks is the Lord speaking. The Lord is speaking through the messenger. And there are times when I think we can plausibly interpret the state of affairs to be occurring in precisely that way. But Bart doesn't talk about that. Instead, you've got angels who are seen as gods. You see how all of a sudden that proposal doesn't recognize the relevant distinction of the purpose of a messenger as a representative? That relevant distinction is missing from Bart's chapter here on how ancient Jews might have understood these divine human figures that were, in this case, angels of that section in chapter 2. So I think that needed a little bit more work. So I was far from persuaded, but we're also not left with too much. Like, there's a lot of information that Bart's providing. It's a survey. I think the survey's got some struggles with it, but I'm really hopeful. I'm looking forward to next week as we jump into looking at chapter 3 on what Jesus thought of himself. So the title of next week's chapter that we'll be looking at is, Did Jesus Think He Was God? And so we'll be getting right into the meat now of the Gospels, I assume, and seeing how Bart interprets the Gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, so that we can try to grasp our mind around what is it that Jesus thought of himself. Not simply what did Matthew communicate about what Jesus thought of himself, but what did Jesus think of himself?